Good morning. I think drinks are on you tonight for that pronunciation of my name twice. So a couple of tequilas for you tonight. Good morning, everyone. My name is Baxolile Mabinya. I'm Executive Director for a company called DVA. DVA is a fairly new organization, and its the purpose really of existence is to help yourselves, all our clients in the enterprise space, service provider and governments, to really create the capacity and capability for digital transformation. So, what is digital transformation? Some believe it's almost like the Smurfs. It really sounds cool, but it's not real. Maybe the first thing that we need to talk about is what is transformation. If you look at the dictionary, transformation is really a marked change in nature and in form. That's what transformation is. So there can never be any transformation without a marked change in nature and in form. So when we talk about digital transformation, what is it that we are actually talking about? Is it the technologies that we are talking about? Is it cloud? Is it AI? Is it IoT? And all of these so-called buzzwords. But really, digital transformation is about a fundamental change of how you do things within your organization. It's not only about technology, but it's really about everything. The work that we've done as DVA, we've seen a lot of trends and how organizations approach digital transformation, and we'll share some of those details here with you. So what are these challenges that we find? Budget is often something that is quoted all the time. Companies, for some reason, still believe in 12-month budgeting cycles. But if you look at the speed at which things actually happen within their client environment and outside within their industries, it doesn't happen in 12-month cycles. It happens a lot quicker. The second and probably one of the most significant issues is a lack of skills. And we'll share with you why we believe this challenge deserves some urgent attention from all of us. Thirdly is the idea of legacy infrastructure. Because when we talk about transformation, it assumes there is something that already exists. You can't transform something that's not there. So we're not talking about new. We're talking about how to take the old to the new. And then lastly, and also really quite important, and often an underestimated factor, is this idea of culture, how you do things within your organization. So these are some of the key issues that we consistently come across when we work with clients right across the board, not only in the service provider industry, but right across the board, across all industries. So in the work that we do, we have made a habit of tracking three things. The first thing that we track is how quickly the money leaves the bank account to buy new technology, right? Because inevitably, our clients buy a lot of technology. The second factor that we look at is how quickly you're able to acquire new customers. Otherwise, what's the point? The whole point of introducing these new technologies is so that you can acquire new customers, increase your revenue, or better profits, but it always has something to do with your customer. And then thirdly is this idea of capability and skills. How quickly and how effectively are you able to actually build the capacity and the skills for you to be able to implement and manage these new technologies? So this is what we see very often. Now, if you look at this graph, you'll see that the velocity of each line is quite significant, and also obviously the quantum across the vertical axis is also quite important. So what typically happens? There's a lot of buzzwords and a lot of pressure to actually spend on new technologies. Companies, without thinking, spend a lot of money and commit themselves to these new technologies. Whether you're buying a new system, whether you are implementing a cloud environment, whether you are spending a lot of money on IoT technology, there is some form of license that costs a fortune that companies actually spend on. But behind this, the actual skill and the capability lags way behind. Customers, very often, when you purchase this technology, are nowhere to be seen, right? So this is typically what happens. And then the medium term, because you've bought the technology and you committed, but you don't have the skill and the capability to operate it, you spend more money because now you need experts to come in and help you to operate and derive value from the technology that you bought. So the gap between these graphs continues to grow in the medium term. The other thing that happens is that the actual utilization of these technologies is actually substandard and quite low. I can't tell you the number of customers where we've gone in and they've bought some form of technology and the utilization sits at 10%. I think the third thing to mention in the medium term is customers. Okay? Customers don't even know about these things. They don't understand them. There's no business model to even buy some of these technologies quite often. And then in the long term, what happens? In the long term, it's time to refresh the technology and the cycle starts again. So you continuously move through the cycle with all of these technologies across the board. So this is one of the biggest business issues that we see with digital transformation. The other thing that we want to talk about is this idea of a context-based approach to digital transformation. It's very important for companies to understand that their starting point with digital transformation depends on their current capability and capacity for digital transformation. Digital transformation is not only about technology. It's about how you invest. It's about your strategy. It's about how you engage your customers. It's about customer insights. It's about what you do with the data and the feedback that comes from your customers. It's about your operations. It's about how you actually manage your services, right? It's about how you actually manage your resource allocation. Of course, it's about technology. It's about the network. It's about your systems. It's about cloud. It's about your productivity tools. It's about how you deal with data, right? It's about culture. It's about leadership. Do they understand what this actually means? It's about how you enable your workforce. It's about your organizational design, right? A lot of people talk about agility. They talk about how fantastic these technologies are to create agile organizations. But yet, when you look at their organizational design and organizational structures, they've got 9, 11 levels in their hierarchy. So what typically happens in companies is you've got these silos where people are running the numbers and the budget for investments, and those people are not talking to the actual people that are running the services for the customers. They're not talking to the people that hire individuals to come and join the organization. Okay? They're not talking to the people that are in sales or in the front end of the business. So what you have in organizations is you've got this mix of all of these individual, almost independent components moving at different speeds and very often moving in opposite directions, which is what we're trying to capture. Now, it's very important, and I don't think I need to say why it's important, that you have a much more coordinated approach to how you actually manage your own digital transformation. Not the digital transformation, but your own digital transformation. And we want to stress the point that skills and capability is probably the most important cog that you need to be focusing on. Because that's the key enabler for you to be able to do all of these other things. So typically, what should happen with digital transformation? Well, this is what we think should happen. We think that if you prioritize building of capability and educating people across all levels, Not just your engineers, because what typically happens is your engineers go off on some SD-WAN or NFV course or AI or big data course. They come back, they've got this new knowledge, they're very excited, they want to do stuff, they write business cases, but the decision makers don't understand what they're actually talking about. So they end up extremely frustrated. They either leave or they become completely disruptive. So it's very important that you actually focus on this knowledge-based approach for digital transformation. And I specifically mention knowledge-based approach purely because often people think that they are acquiring knowledge when they're actually learning how to use a specific tool. And of course, it's very important for all of us to ultimately make a decision and choose the best tool that we will use for whatever we actually want to implement. But it's equally important that from the onset, we don't focus on a tool-based approach. We focus on a knowledge-based approach so that your people are able to say, if we are going to have a software-defined network, we understand based on our organization, our own capability, our customers, our partners, that the best tool to use is X and not Y, and we can justify that reason. You need to give your people this opportunity. I think in the medium term, if you take this approach, you are then able to also include some of your customers. Because we're not talking about theoretical learning and conceptual learning about these terms such as SDN and cloud and AI and big data. What we're talking about is an approach where your people can actually touch and feel these things and experiment themselves. And if you take this approach, you are able to actually invest in your capabilities, right? Much more than you invest in a specific tool that will commit you long term. So we've got this term now at Divya where we're talking about learn faster than you buy. Is really an important thing for organizations to begin to focus on. And I think in the long term, ideally what you see is if you take this approach of learning ahead of your buying cycles, you also have an opportunity to include your own clients, your own customers in that learning process. So that by the time you get to the end, all of these technologies and your value propositions sell themselves. You don't have a process where you spend a fortune and you spend many months or even years developing these new value propositions or products or services, and then at the end hope that there will be some people in your organization that can convince customers to actually buy them. So at this specific point, I do want to invite my colleague, Pramod Venkatesh, to come up on stage. Because what we want to do now is to get into the detail of the actual methodologies that we believe can help you to navigate the space of digital transformation. I'm going to stand to the side and count how many times Pramod says, folks. Pramod, over to you.
Thank you, Bax, for the nice introduction. As Bax was mentioning about the digital transformation, and based on my experience of seeing this and implementing this for some of the service providers in my career, I think that is really, really important that this entire approach is a more top-down approach rather than a bottom-up approach. It's not about engineers going and finding out these new terms coming out from different events such as this and going back and trying to do something in silos, right? This entire thing, when we talk about digital transformation, essentially you have an existing platform which you need to move about, right? When we talk about legacy enterprise IT, whether you are a service provider or an enterprise or you're just a vendor, all of you are essentially in this state, wherein which you have your own data centers, your own model in which you operate is essentially not agile. You actually operate in silos wherein which your marketing team does not talk to, let's say, the IT team does not talk to your operations team. So it's kind of how it's been there. And this structure is essentially kept in place because that's how it was easier, because most of your system before was not required to be this agile. And finally, the entire IT, as we call it, was essentially a siloed organization, which was somebody who could come and fix your computer or your internet when something is not working. That's how it was treated as in most of these organizations. And finally, you have the process-driven and operations, which were completely the entire ITIL process which you actually built in. Every change you had put into the network or every change you wanted to put in your application actually took almost a month's time to happen because of the various approval process which was there. But what is happening is the consumer is changing. They are requesting faster services to be sent out. They are requesting better process, and they're requesting better clarity in terms of what you offer to them. And that is essentially what the entire digital transformation journey talks about, where in which your enterprise IT changing from your data center to cloud, moving to a more agile model, because that's essentially how you fast track your entire process. And then you kind of start treating, rather than siloed organization, start building an ecosystem. Start putting places in which your entire team can come and communicate and understand how each one can learn from other. And primarily, IT is no longer something which you can treat it as just as a siloed organization. You might be a bank, you might be a vendor of some services, but essentially IT is going to be the one which is going to generate revenue as we move forward, right? As far as everybody talking in this conference, everyone talked about basically automation being the key piece. How do you drive this automation if you don't provide enough services for IT? They are the guys who are going to build and connect those different dots in each of your organization and finally able to deliver that in a seamless experience, right? I think Greg from last time was talking about how do we automate that process. That entire process can only be automated if IT is thought about as the single process wherein which you can actually derive revenue. That's how it's going to change, right? And finally, you need to take data-driven decisions rather than process-driven decisions, which means if you have to keenly rely on the amount of data being generated by your customers, by your marketing teams, by your sales, from your devices, to actually consolidate all this and view it at one, so that your decisions are much more groundwork rather than somebody taking a decision based on their intuition or some of this. So what are the trends in the digital transformation? So we talk about artificial intelligence, IoT, cloud, big data, blockchain, which is the recent one. I'm not talking about the cryptocurrency one, which is not the right place to talk about, but blockchain in general for ledgering and automation of that. And finally, the 5G transformation, which is happening. So how do we take all these trends which are happening and how do we drive them as an organizational process? So this is where it's very important to have this digital transformation journey. So as Bax was talking about, it's not just about somebody from the IT team taking trainings and coming back and saying, let us drive this new tool which is out there. Or somebody from, let's say, the technology team coming and saying, let us transform something. Or basically having somebody from your CIO team saying, let us start taking this specific track and start building digital transformation out of it. There need to be a clear strategy on how you're going to start from the top and trickle that towards your employees so that they all will be able to actually get hold of the entire message which you are driving, right? That involves your customers, that involves your employees, that involves your managers. All of them put together can drive this. So essentially you start with the vision. How do you want to actually see where your business is going to go? And that is essentially CIO vision which comes there. And finally your business strategy. How do I drive these business strategy? How do I change my model? How do I sell differently when I start talking about these different business strategies, right? And then finally you talk about workforce skills transformation. This is a very, very important requirement because right now there are a lot of legacy which we are operating on, and the cultural shift which is required to adopt digital itself is very, very important. And that is a key piece which holds both the technology and the strategy and the execution together. And finally, plan for an IT transformation plan in terms of how do you migrate them and have the technology upgrade in place. So when you talk about CIO vision, you first identify the journey and understand what exactly digital means for your organization. This is very key, because if you don't understand what exactly is digital, and if you don't know what you're going to drive the services out of it, then it will not have any clear impact, right? And finally, plan some of the execution, because that's where you have to find out which teams in your organization are the ones who are going to be driving this innovation, right? Find out which product or which service are you going to first try it out, and involve the right stakeholders, right? And create a program for management, education, and cultural change, because your managers may not have seen this and may not be ready to actually adopt this transformation. There are a lot of places in my previous career where we went and said, let's not adopt the standard ITIL process for change of the configurations. It was not accepted because that was the industry norm. But today, the DevOps and some of the culture has been adopted not only just from the IT level, but more from a CIO level as well. Taking to the business strategy point of view, ensure that you do take data-driven decisions. Ensure that you have enough amount of data where you do business machine learning, do analytics, and also take technology-driven opportunities, which means change of the model in which you provide. So if you are just a fiber provider, you're just providing just a fiber to the home or just providing connectivity between two elements, think about what are the best value-added services which I can put on top of it to drive my traffic. That's really important, and that's how you pump in more data into the system. And secondly, whenever you talk about business, one of the important things is the risk management, where you talk about regulatory compliance, fraud detection, and some of these things, and how do you manage that is using artificial intelligence and machine learning. And that has been the key part. Wherever you go today, that is where you generate a lot of data, you need to have some sort of analytics which gives you meaningful insight into how do you take those decisions. And finally, this is the most critical part, and when Bax was showing the slide where each of those gears were turning in different directions, you can see the most slowest part of the component is actually your workforce and skill set transformation. That's where there's real dearth of gap, because what is happening is you're actually seeing a whole bunch of areas getting consolidated. You know, in olden times, we had, network engineer, you had a software engineer, you had a hardware engineer, you had a field engineer, all of them having different skill set where they could actually go and update themselves. Whereas now, you're seeing the same set of guys actually performing all the tasks, right? As and when your vendors are providing more open API ecosystems, as and when you're trying to drive automation, which means your network engineer can no longer shy away and say, hey, I'm not going to learn software. That's going to be a very key element, because they're the ones who know how the system works. Whenever you try to automate any of these network components, you need them to understand what exactly software is all about. So this is where the workforce skill set transformation comes into the picture. So in which you identify first the top skill set which is required for your transformation. You identified first of all the gaps which is present in your existing workforce. So you can see whether do you have software engineers, do you really need them, and finally work on the right training partners to train them, right? And then ensure that the labs you have, because most of the times everyone complains that I don't have enough hands-on experience. I know it from a theoretical point of view, but how do I take that and apply it, right? And finally, incorporate as part of employee quarter review. So every employee is, they're looking into, they're doing Google search and finding out these new exciting terms, but they are really worried because they are no longer in that picture. So they are wondering, how do I make that as part of my transformation themselves? And if you incorporate it as part of your employee quarter review, it helps them, because that's where they can clearly add value, and also you can motivate the employee. And finally, the culture transformation is very important. You need to adopt agile practices, which means you no longer can have too much of process, right? So for example, in most of companies, getting a simple pen takes, I think, 3 or 4 paperworks to just pass it on, to just get that pen. And imagine how long it would take to actually push a specific configuration in some of the network devices. So that cannot happen, because your customers are requesting faster changes. The moment they lay a fiber to your home, that's what we were talking about in the morning, that how quickly can I get access to that megabit of data, right? I think Andre waited 2 weeks. That's not supposed to happen, right? That's where automation and agile practices really helps into the process. And encourage employees to take risk. This is very important because as and when your employees are coming in and doing these new exciting things, there are going to be failures. There are going to be outages which will happen, right? In my previous career, when we were building one of the largest OpenStack cloud, it was completely difficult for us to manage this. And one of the key important things is we failed a couple of times before we actually succeeded. The management was behind us every time we failed, because without that, we wouldn't be able to take these new technologies and go out there into the market, right? So that is very, very important. And of course, the final part is encourage open source adoption. Lot of places, when we talk about open source, it's treated as something which is completely out there. But one of the key important thing is, lot of these new areas which are coming in, open source is the driving force behind it. It will help you to save cost and adopt faster processes because a lot of stuff is already out there. People, a lot of vendors have already tried it, and how do you take it and make it part of your process? So that is something which will save you licensing cost and reduce the overall cost of your product finally which you put out there. And finally, you prepare something of an IT transformation plan, which means you identify legacy environments and you re-architect your applications, infrastructure, networks, right? You first try understanding where can I bring in microservices. If I have a huge application which is a single tier application sitting, can I actually have microservice there? Because that's how where the industry is trending to, and that provides you more agility in terms of your systems. Where do I include cloud in that? Why am I spending so much of money on my servers for hosting? How can I adopt some of these new trends such as SDN and NFV to reduce the overall cost of my ecosystem? And finally, work with vendors whose solutions support these things, right? You might be working with vendor A, but that vendor A, if he's not actually having these new next generation technologies, then change your vendor. Take that necessary risk to change your vendor. Start looking at young companies which have open API ecosystems which you can actually adopt, right? And finally, prepare your migration plans and explore, as I said, open source alternatives to explore, reduce licensing cost and increase agility. This will really help because most of the cases you already have some of the software which is written. You just need to repackage it and use it, and that's where the open source world really helps in terms of, I'm not sure if you have heard about Kubernetes and some of these stuff which is released by Google. Today, the world is essentially running on them. So it's not something which is out of the way to actually go ahead and try to experiment with open source. And adopt DevOps as a practice in all areas. That is one of the key element what you need, right? So what does the next generation technology stack look like? So you look about applications, you have microservices, containers, serverless architectures, you have infrastructure where you are learning Kubernetes, OpenStack and clouds. You have networking where you're looking at software-defined networking, NFV, SD-WAN, which are the two main primary areas. And you have data analytics and management. These are the cases in which you can start looking at and seeing how I can drive some of my services. Because the more automation you put into your environment, the more you need to have these things set in place. Because that's how we are going to drive faster adoption of the entire process. So what is the final impact of the transformation? So let's assume you do all this and you finally get there. The point is, instead of looking at an individual network-based focus, you now start looking at autonomous virtual infrastructure where you have AI and ML driving some of the infrastructure. Your consumers are going to get very quick resources. You no longer have to wait for 2 weeks to get a fiber to the home, right? The moment they put it, they can change the plans on demand, they can change the bandwidth on demand, and they are actually providing more value-added services on top to drive revenue. And finally, you talk about the operational focus. So you start looking at multiple business models rather than looking at a very specific business model. You start providing more and more value-added services on top of it. And finally, you talk about the service focus where you start looking at exposing your APIs and working with different partners. So rather than your partners working with them where each of the sales process and everything else is not directly integrated, you can start exposing your services to them so that there's a more quicker adoption and more closer exchange of data between the two partners. So that way you can foster and innovate at a much faster rate. So that's pretty much it from my side. I think I'd like to give the last slide to Bax to introduce some of the partnership we are having with them. So Bax.
Thank you, Pramod. It seems like I was wrong. The word is not folks, it's finally. So just on the last point, to make. So Divya is a South African-born company, is partnering with Criterion Networks so that we can bring, in practical terms, this workforce transformation to yourselves and to companies across the continent. And what we would love to announce is on the 8th, the 6th to the 8th of November, we are going to have our first training session where it's going to be instructor-led. It's going to be based in Johannesburg. It's a week before AfricaCom, where most of you, I'm sure, are going to be attending. It's really for your people, your technical skills, so that they can get their hands dirty with these new concepts of SDN, SD-WAN, and NFV, as well as cloud. And how it's going to work is, of course, there's content that's going to be covered in the sessions, but we are going to be leveraging the platforms that Criterion Networks have built so that they are able to actually spin up their labs and move to POC, pilot, and hopefully to other things as well. This training is vendor agnostic, so it's not Viptela or Cisco only, but there are others as well, Citrix, etc., etc. So that's what we are going to be doing first up in November. And then, of course, from there, we are going to be focusing on other elements as well. So thank you very much for this opportunity. You can just go to the link to RSVP for the event. Thank you very much.
Thank you, folks.
Thank you, Bax. Pramod, thank you very much. Yes, I was a little confused. I think, I don't know what the number of and finally was, but I strained my glutamus maximus 15 times at least trying to get up thinking it was the last point. No, well done, guys. Yeah, digital transformation, I guess for those of us in this room, it's a little bit beyond digging trenches and reinstating pavements and laying fiber, but one of the things I think we've all learned in this organization is what we call school fees. We've paid a lot of school fees by not doing it right and by not having the right systems in place and probably trying to manage our organizations on Excel spreadsheets and things like that that result in a bad customer experience at the end of the day. So what are the questions? Is there anyone from the audience that has a burning question they'd like to ask while we have the experts on the table here? Like I said, school fees. Gentlemen, what are some of the mistakes you've seen that companies have made that you think could have been avoided if they had, or perhaps that's the way they got experience by making the mistake in the first place? What are some of those mistakes?
Well, I think, as I mentioned in one of the slides, I think one of the biggest mistakes that we see is early commitment to a specific technology. Without necessarily, thinking about the other dimensions of, the business, and more specifically, without actually thinking about, the skills and the capability to actually manage these technologies. So I think, a lot of the time there's this commitment to say, well, we've bought this license, and there's this idea that everything now must happen as a result of that purchase. So it's almost reverse engineering and doing things the other way around. So that's probably one of the key mistakes that companies make. I don't know, Pramod, if you want to add to that.
So I think one of the key things when we have been working with a couple of customers in the past is there's not really direct connection between where the business is going and what the transformation skill set which is happening with the teams. So what happens is there's a clear gap in expectations in terms of, the companies, the employees are going and getting trained in some of these various different technologies, but finally none of the business is actually moving in that direction. So what is happening is there's a clear gap where the employee is frustrated in terms of, have learned all these things, but nothing is happening on the ground. So that's one of the key areas wherein we need to bridge. That is, the expectation of what you want to do as the workforce transformation needs to be in sync what your business is, where it's going to.
Okay, anybody like to ask a question? This gentleman in the front here.
Thank you for the great presentation. My name is Tebiswante Tagan. I'm from Lesotho. In an earlier presentation, we heard that we need to move towards having truly open access networks. But at the same time, you are advocating for fiber providers to provide value-added services on top of their networks. So I just wanted to have an idea of what type of services would a fiber provider deploy, which won't compete with his primary customers, which are the ISPs.
Yeah. So one of the key things here in the fiber services space is essentially the bandwidth management itself, right? So you are actually selling your bandwidth to your fiber provider, to your ISPs. So one of the key areas where right now what happens is the amount of bandwidth exchange which happens between your various ISPs is completely, it's manual. You have the ISP saying, I need X amount of bandwidth, and then you actually go and purchase that bandwidth. You ask your engineers to configure it. But what happens is once you start providing an open API ecosystem, you kind of integrate these two elements with your ISPs, which means the ISP is able to now have a better mechanism to actually set and gain those bandwidth in an automatic fashion, and wherein which you are actually charging them for your service providers. That's one. The second part is essentially, since you're having all this traffic flowing through your network, you can start providing value-added analytics on top of it. That's one of the key areas where a lot of companies are actually looking at, to saying, how do we know what is exactly happening? And you can actually provide these analytics to your ISPs, who in turn provide it to your customers. So which means getting access to that kind of data. So most of the times you would actually be working with the ISPs, because you don't want to be launching the same set of products and services, but rather working with the ISPs so that their end customers actually get much better value out of it. So hopefully, yeah.
Yeah, maybe just one quick comment on that. We also advocate for open networks. In fact, we advocate for open everything, not only the networks, but what Pramod is saying around APIs is something that we believe is the right thing to do, for the industry, and will significantly create more value. We're working with a customer now that owns a fiber network, and they are a wholesaler. So some of their customers are ISPs, but they also sell to MNOs, etc. And one of the key issues with a lot of these new technologies is that no one has an answer in that specific market. So the wholesale provider has not implemented a software-based network, but over and above that, all of these things that we're talking about that you call value-added services, even the ISPs actually don't have them. The feedback from the ISPs is that, look, we want quick to market, we want something that is scalable so you can switch it on and off, but we just simply don't have the bandwidth or the capability to be able to develop these value-added services ourselves. So if we can work together with you, we think it will probably be the best thing. So that way you are able to still maintain this philosophy of having an open network, but at the same time you are able to work within an ecosystem, not because you are creating those value-added services for yourself only, but you are working with your entire ecosystem to actually make sure that they have access to them. And I think that's really the approach that we are advocating.
Excellent. Okay, I think we can wrap it up. Maybe just one last thought. Jobs. How is this going to affect jobs with all this orchestration, this automation? we still need people to have a living. How are we going to do that?
Oh, Andrew, that's a fantastic question. Again, I'll just use an example. We worked with a customer who were very concerned about jobs. They employ 50,000 people, and they felt that with the digital transformation, a lot of people were actually going to lose their jobs. And they asked us to develop a digital, workforce plan for the future. And one of the things that we've advocated to them is the exact same message that we're talking about here, that we need to train our people with these new technologies. Because as the old jobs that might not be necessary in creating the value, there'll be many other possibilities of jobs that require new age skills where people can really create significantly more value for their organizations and their customers. And I think that's the general philosophy that we adopt as Divya. And when we work with our clients, we look for those opportunities of how to take the existing skills and transform them into these new age skills.
Digital transformation in parallel with skills transformation.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Sustainability. Gentlemen, thank you very much. A round of applause. Thank you.